Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is May 1st, 2014, and my guest is Marc Andreessen, legendary entrepreneur and venture capitalist. He's the co-creator of Mosaic, the co-founder of Netscape, and more recently the co-founder of the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz. Marc, welcome to EconTalk.
Russ, it's great to be here. Thank you.
I want to start with your career. You were at the heart of the first browser war between Netscape and Internet Explorer. That seems like hundreds of years ago. It's a little more recently than that, but give us a quick thumbnail of what happened to Netscape and then how you escaped from that war.
Yeah, so Netscape was founded actually 20 years ago this month. It's a sort of a special time for me. Netscape as a company grew incredibly quickly. We grew from 0 to 3,500 employees in 3 years. It was actually really funny. Netscape was always thought of as this small little browser company, and people used to come visit us on the campus, and they would just be completely flabbergasted at all the buildings and all the people. And the reason we had all those people was because in addition to browsers, we built a very broad range of internet software and internet services at that time. And so we were one of the first companies that did internet e-commerce systems. We're one of the first companies that did internet publishing systems. Our software for a long time powered actually a lot of the big newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal. We actually are the company that built cryptography into the web. And so the way that people do encryption now was us. We created core technologies like JavaScript. For a couple of years, we were the largest internet advertising business in the world with the Netscape website and Netscape portal. And so that collective business grew to about $600 million a year in revenue within 4 years from start. And then actually ultimately what happened was we sold the company. We sold the company to America Online in 1998. So the entire thing was start to finish in 4 years, which felt like an eternity at the time, but in retrospect was the blink of an eye.
And what happened to Marc Andreessen at the time of that sale? Did you go with that sale or did you leave?
Yeah, I actually became the chief technology officer of America Online. AOL actually in that time was the most valuable internet company, and so AOL within a year after our sale, AOL was a company that was worth $170 billion on the stock market, and that was a company that was in the dial-up ISP business, if you recall that. They had 25 million dial-up ISPs. And that was right before the arrival of broadband, which was going to just completely destroy the dial-up ISP business. For those who believe in the efficient market hypotheses, one of the counterexamples would be a dial-up ISP worth $170 billion heading straight into broadband, which made no sense at all.
Well, it didn't last that long.
It did not last that long. Well, and in fact, what happened was the management team at AOL actually figured that out. I mean, they realized it. And so actually, right, what happened was they traded their equity, which they knew was going to collapse in value. They traded it for Time Warner equity. And they bought Time Warner. And so that led to the famous AOL-Time Warner merger, which was one of the great catastrophes, in recent business history. I actually I was at AOL for about a year, stayed for about a year. We have this sort of tradition in the tech industry where when your company gets bought, you typically have a period of indentured servitude, where you stay for at least a while to help make sure the integration happens. And so I stayed for a year and then I left and started my second company.
Which was?
Which was actually the first cloud computing company. So this now kind of big trend of cloud computing was something we helped kick off in 1999. That was a company called Loud Cloud. And that was really the first company doing what today is done with things like Amazon Web Services. That company actually also grew very fast. We grew from a standing start to quite a large business in the course of the first year. And then we hit the dot-com collapse like running into a buzzsaw. And so half of our customers were .coms, which virtually all went bankrupt. And then the other half were big companies. Our clients were big companies who were in a panic because they felt like they had to compete with the .coms by launching all kinds of new internet efforts. And when the .coms went bankrupt, most of those big companies said, oh, I guess this internet thing isn't serious. I guess it's all going to go away. And they shut down most of those efforts. And so we almost lost that company. My business partner, Ben Horowitz, has actually recently written a book, which is now a bestseller, called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And it's a business book, and it actually tells the whole story of LoudCloud, where he was my business partner and he was the CEO. And it's a dramatic story because we almost lost the company. We almost went bankrupt. And then through kind of a series of near miracles, we were able to do what's called a restart. We basically completely restarted the company as a public company into a completely different business, and then ultimately grew it to be a successful software company. And then Hewlett-Packard bought that company in 2007 for about $1.6 billion.
Was that your main use of your time in that 99 to 2000 to 2007 period?
Yeah, I was basically those were I started those companies basically back to back, and so Netscape was basically a company in the middle of the boom, 1994 to 1998, and sort of rode the upward momentum of the 90s tech boom. LoudCloud was started at the very end of the boom. We started in September '99. So we had about 6 good months before everything caved in. And then, most of LoudCloud, which became Opsware, most of that company was during the bust. And so we just kept on going all the way through the crash. And, just kind of kept slugging away through 2002, 2003, 2004 when things got really miserable in the tech industry. And then we sold the company kind of right as the industry was we sold that company right as the industry was coming out the other end in 2007, headed straight into the credit crisis. So in retrospect, that was probably good timing to sell that company as well.
And at that point, when did you start Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital firm?
Yeah, so we started the planning for the firm. We spent about a year and a half planning and thinking it through, and we started that process actually in 2007. So my partner Ben and I sort of spent nights and weekends kind of writing the business plan and thinking through all the strategic kind of things that we had to work out. And then we kicked off the fundraising process in March of 2009. And I remember that very distinctly because March of 2009 was the low of the stock market after the credit crisis.
Yep.
And so nobody was raising a new venture capital fund in the spring of 2009. It was not a time when investors wanted to hear about a new venture capital fund. In fact, many of the large investors in venture capital and private equity were in a liquidity crisis in their own businesses, including the big university endowments, where they were having a real trouble meeting their commitments back to their sponsoring organizations. And so it was one of the more people have told us it was the harshest, most hostile time to raise a new venture capital fund in 40 years. Of course, we're, contrarian or perverse depending on how you look at it. And we said, well, that's probably then going to be a very good time to raise a venture capital fund because
sure. You'll be alone. You'll be alone.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, we were. There were actually only 2 venture capital funds that got raised in 2009 in the entire year. One was ours, and the other was Vinod Khosla raised a new fund. He's one of the top venture capitalists in history of all time.
Who is that again?
It's a gentleman named Vinod Khosla, and he runs his own firm called Khosla Ventures. He previously was a partner at Kleiner Perkins.
Yep.
So he was one of the partners at Kleiner Perkins who made them so successful in the 90s. And then before that, he was a co-founder of a company called Sun Microsystems.
I've heard of them.
Which was a big, successful technology company. So he's one of the legendary tech entrepreneurs and investors of all time. And so it was I think it was straightforward for him to raise a new fund. It was a bit harder for us, but we were able to raise it. And that turned out to be a very good time to raise a fund because it put us in a position to invest when a lot of other people had stopped investing.
So even though I'd say you've been around now, as the firm's been around for 5 years, it's been 5 of the least pleasant years in the American economy that weren't called a recession. Officially, the recession ended in 2009, but it's been a pretty mediocre run for the U.S. economy since then. But the technology world's been doing okay, and you've invested, according to the internet at least, and of course the internet never lies. You've invested in Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Foursquare, and so on, which are pretty successful companies. My question is, does that make you feel smart? Or is investing still a very humiliating and uncertain process?
Well, venture capital is kind of guaranteed to be humiliating because the most successful venture capitalists of all time typically tank about half their investments. By which I mean, if you take any of the top performing venture capital firms over the last 40 or 50 years, and if you look at if you get inside their portfolios and look at their portfolios. And these are the top firms, like the ones that return amazing returns over long periods of time. typically they lose half their companies, right? In other words, half their companies go under, and they either return nothing for the original investment, or they return a fraction of the original investment. And so it's the kind of business, it's a feast or famine business. And in the same portfolio, you have both feast and famine. You'll have a company that gives you a 10x, or, if things go well, 100x or 1,000x return, and you'll have 6 other companies that are failing. The sort of, twist then to how you spend your time is you spend most of your time actually dealing with your companies that are struggling and trying to help them, right? Because it's the companies that are struggling or failing that actually need the most help, right? The companies that are succeeding are generally doing just fine without you. The companies that are failing are the ones who really need help and support. And so a lot of what you end up doing at the job is supporting struggling entrepreneurs. And so it's kind of continuously humbling. There's always something, there's always something, you're a troubleshooter, right? There's always something going wrong. And psychologically, you just have to, we talk about this when we recruit partners, is you have to be psychologically prepared for the opposite of a life. It seems like it'll be a life of glamour and excitement. It's more of a life of struggle and misery. And if you're okay with that, because it's part of the package, then the overall deal is pretty good.
Yeah, I'd still call it nice work if you can get it.
It is. It beats all the jobs I had when I was a teenager.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's great. Yeah.
But what's interesting to me as an outsider is that you don't get particularly. You learn things, I'm sure, as you go forward, but you still fail at least half the time. It's not like, well, those 5 of the 10, those were the losers. Now, next time I'll miss those. I won't invest in those. But you still have to fail 5 out of 10. You don't know which 5 are going to be.
Yeah, so the reason for that is we think you can draw a 2x2 matrix for venture capital. And this is probably true for all investing, but it's certainly true for venture capital, which is you can basically draw a 2x2. And on one axis, you could say consensus versus non-consensus. And on the other axis, you can say successful or failure. And of course, you make all your money on successful and non-consensus. And definitionally, the reason is because it's very hard to make money on successful and consensus. Because if something is already consensus, then money will have already flooded in and the profit opportunity is gone. And so by definition in venture capital, if you're doing it right, you're continuously investing in things that are non-consensus at the time of investment. And let me translate non-consensus to practical terms. It translates to crazy, right? You're investing in things that look like they're just nuts, right? Like who would believe, right? I mean, and this is kind of continuously the case through history. Who would believe that this VC thing would work at the time when the VCs were investing in PC companies? The whole thing was considered to be a joke. When I started with, internet startups, the internet, the one thing everybody knew for sure was nobody would ever make any money at the internet, right? There would never be a business.
Right. Just a toy for communicating a little bit and interacting, but it's not going to, there's no revenue stream that's going to come from it.
Yeah, certainly not. And obviously the one thing you know for sure is nobody's ever going to buy anything over the internet. That would be crazy, right? Because, hackers might steal it, So, and then you go on and on and on, and Google, eBay looked non-consensus, right, at the time. A venture capital firm called Benchmark made the eBay investment, and a lot of people looked at eBay and they said, that's crazy. Who's going to buy something from a seller somewhere around the world who they've never met before? Like, that's just nuts.
And it's used. And it's not even a new thing. It's often a piece of it's garage sale material.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And that continues to the present day. And, more recently you have these things, Airbnb we're very involved in. And Airbnb is an idea. Even a couple of years ago, a lot of people were like, Airbnb is this idea that you're going to rent out the back room in your house and then a random stranger is going to show up and stay in the room. That's crazy, right? You would never do that. You would never rent out the room. And of course, you would never stay in a stranger's house. And it turns out Airbnb, people love this and it's growing like crazy. And it's, the revenue is exploding.
Well,
now, the corollary to it, of course, is crazy does not mean correct, right?
Crazy often, my next point.
Right, crazy often just means crazy.
Yeah.
And so you get some of both. Yeah, exactly.
I used to teach a business plan class in a business school, and one of my students submitted a business plan that in the financials over the life of the company made no money for the foreseeable future. And I said, well, that's a little bit discouraging to a potential investor. And the student said, oh, well, all the best companies don't make any money. So that's a plus, not a minus. So that's the challenge. Every crazy idea is not successful. It's a kind of a reverse causation confusion there.
Yeah, exactly.
What you've made but despite all that, you've made some very successful bets, presumably on non-consensus companies that at the time, 140 characters as a form of communication does seem like a very ridiculous idea. Are there some you missed that you regret that you want to talk about? Are there some lessons you learned that now you can't believe those are the mistakes you made back then?
Oh, sure. So, so as a corollary to this, the mistakes that we make in a field like venture capital, the mistakes generally aren't investing in something that turns out not to work. And this is something the press, I think, in particular, really struggles to figure out, because it's like you put all this money in something and it failed and it wasn't that a mistake. That's generally not the problem. The problem is what you just said, which is it's the big hit that you missed. And so every venture capitalist who didn't, who had the opportunity to invest in Google and didn't, right, just feels like an idiot. Every venture capitalist who had the opportunity to invest in Facebook and didn't, feels like an idiot. The challenge in the field is all of the great VCs, each of the great VCs over the last 50 years, the thing that they all have in common is they all fail to invest in most of the big winners. And so this, again, is part of the humility to the profession, which is, you literally, as an investor in any of these things, you can make, even if you've invested in some of the hits, you can make a long list of the hits that you missed, and those are the ones that drive you crazy. I was not a professional investor prior to 5 years ago, so we'll see in the fullness of time which ones I've missed in this period. But one of the things we do a lot is we try to back test our theories against history. And so, because we sit around all day long and talk about, like, what are we looking for and how do we know that it's going to be great? And, it's like we sort of debate criteria for investment, all day long. And one of the questions I always ask us, and I'm not sure of the answer, is would we have invested in Google when they were raising venture capital? And the reason I actually wonder whether that's the case, and the reason is a good friend of mine was at another venture firm that passed on Google when they had the chance to invest in it. And I said, why'd you pass on Google? And this is back right around the same time that it happened. So I know that it's kind of accurate as opposed to just revisionist history. So we passed on Google for three reasons. He said there were three reasons. He said, number one, absolutely no business model. They had absolutely no idea how they were going to make money. Number two, the two most arrogant founders we'd ever met in our lives. And number three, very high premium valuation. And he said, had there been only any two of those three problems, they would have still invested. But all three problems together prevented them from doing it. And in venture capital, that's a $20 billion mistake.
Yeah, but
right?
If those are your three rules, you might save enough money on the other $30 billion that you might have thrown away. $30 billion is hard to throw away. That's not a good answer, maybe. I don't know. But you see my point, though.
Well, but that's precisely you identified the exact problem, and then the problem with the problem, which is that it's a game. It's the key characteristic of venture capital is the returns are on a power law distribution, right? So this basically. So here's the way to think about it in the math. There's about 4,000 startups a year, tech startups a year that want to raise venture capital. Of those, maybe 400 will get funded by top venture capital firms. Of those, about 15 will be responsible for over 90% of the profits for that entire year of companies.
And that says it all.
So it's a feast or famine business. If you do invest in Google and you invest in 100 losers, you're a spectacular success.
Yeah.
If you don't invest in Google and you invest in 100 losers, you're a horrible failure. And it turned out the only decision that mattered was did you invest in Google or not. And of course, right, the corollary to it is you never know when Google's going to show up. Right. One of the weird things about Google was they showed up in 1999. So a couple of things about Google that would have made it hard at the time, which is, if you believe there was a bubble in 1999, which a lot of people think that they believed, at least in retrospect, that would have been the last time you want to invest in a money-losing company run by arrogant founders at a premium valuation. Yeah. And yet that was the one to do. Second thing is Google was like the 35th search engine, right? It was not, there's this whole thing about first to market, and the innovator and the whole thing. And there had been 6 years of search engines before Google, many of whom at that point were large public companies and were considered very successful companies, Yahoo, Lycos, there were a whole bunch. And Google was late to the game. Now, it turns out they were late to the game with a fundamentally better product. And so my friend Peter Thiel likes to say, he says, it's not first to market that matters, it's last to market. You want to be the last company? Because you want to be the company that basically shuts down all following competition?
Yeah. If you can do that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But what he says is basically that's the key to actually getting all the investment returns, which is you want to be the one that basically is so good that it forecloses all future competition. And that often is not the first company. And so if you think about the decision path that you would have had, a lot of people think that if they had seen Google in 1999 and had walked to the door, they would have been smart enough to make their investment. But the actual decision path that you would have had to follow in your own head to get all the way to the idea of investing in these guys with no business model at that time in a field that had already a ton of competition was a good idea. Like, that was a leap. And it's no coincidence, by the way, that investment was made by two of the smartest VCs of all time, John Doerr and Mike Moritz, right? Is like, that was a leap. That required, real foresight, deep thought process, and then a risk tolerance that most people simply don't have. And so on our best days, that's what we aspire to be like. We aspire to take the bets that other people won't make. We aspire to go way out on the edge of risk. Another friend of mine once said, Mark, he said, you're ruined. You'll use venture capital, whatever. You'll never be able to work in any other area of financial services or investing, because in every other area of investing, it's all about reducing risk. Whereas in venture capital, it's all about increasing risk. The big danger is you're not far enough out on the risk curve.
How much did Doerr and Morris put into Google at that point? Do you know?
They put in about $25 million between the two of them. And they bought, I believe $25 million bought somewhere between 15 to 20% of the company.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would have gotten diluted down over time. So that would have translated to probably, let's call it 10 to 12% of the company today. And Google today is worth $340 billion.
Yeah.
So
it's a good deal.
The sort of 25 million turned into, if they held the stock, which they, some of them didn't, but if they had held the stock all the way through 15 years later, 25 million turns into somewhere between 35 and 50 billion.
Yeah, that'll pay for a lot of mistakes. What do you think was, you're suggesting that what made Google better than, I'm old enough, as many of our listeners are, that's what's great about the internet. I'm not talking about the Korean War now. I'm talking about the 1990s. I remember Lycos and Yahoo as search engines. Of course, people still use Yahoo sometimes as a search engine, but you're suggesting that Google dominated that market because they had a, quote, better product. What was better about it?
Yeah, so my friend Bill Joyce says the key difference is that it had the "it works" feature. It had the feature where it worked. If you remember doing searches, on back in those days on like most of these other systems, you would do the search and you would get back basically, you would very often get back useless results. And the programmers of those companies worked really hard to try to get you back those results, but like a lot of the time you got back just got back noise. And what had actually happened was it turns out users had got trained to not expect much from their search engine. Right, so they had gotten trained that the results were going to be very good. And so users actually didn't do that many searches, and when they did, they would spend a lot of time going through and trying to find the one good results, out of the first 100 links or something like that. The people who really understood this stuff, number one, you could use Google early on if you had early access to it, and you could compare the results and you could just see that they were better. And it was very, very, very visible and very visceral. And then, of course, better results, not only is better results, it also means people are going to use it a lot more. And so people would use Google a lot more than they would use the other ones. And then if you were a computer scientist and you had access to these guys and you could talk to them, what you would find out is they had a completely different kind of approach than the previous search engines. And they had this innovation that became famous called PageRank, where they just had basically a computer science breakthrough, an actual technological breakthrough in how to do the scoring to get to the best search results. And it turned out those things were discoverable. This is one of the things we find, you had to be very close to the company to realize this, right? This was very hard to call from the outside. And a lot of people who passed on Google without even getting to the point where they learned these details. And it turned out the details really mattered because they really did make a big difference.
Right. The elevator pitch, I have a better search engine, is not that compelling.
Yeah.
Because the question would be how much better and who cares and then what? And they answered all those questions, although, like you say, from the outside, that was probably very hard to discern, especially the and then what, because the ability to monetize that product was not obvious at all, even if you got into the guts of the algorithm. Yeah,
and then, by the way, even then you would have had to invest not knowing how they were going to make money.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have that second part. They figured that second part out.
Yeah.
One of the things I like to say is, we live in one of many parallel universes, and we know how this one played out, but there exist universes in which every other scenario played out. And there are many other universes in which Google never figured out how to make money.
Yeah.
And crashed and burned and would be a cautionary tale today. And there are just twists of fate that happen along the way where they were able to figure out this, AdWords algorithm to be able to make money. But had they not figured that out, and a lot of people didn't think they would be able to figure that out, we would be having a very different conversation today. And so it's one of the things, again, it goes back to what's humbling about what we do is it's, limits to knowledge, right? There are real limits to what you can know, which, by the way, it means that if you're going to operate in this field and if your requirement for investing in something or, backing something or going to work for something is you're going to know for sure that it'll succeed, you're never going to do anything.
Yeah. No,
right?
For sure.
There is no, there is no return without the risk.
Well, one of my favorite stories is how Fred Smith supposedly, it may not be true, but supposedly after he got turned down for the last time by Chicago banks to borrow money to keep FedEx afloat, was in the Chicago airport and ready to return to Memphis to tell his employees that it was over. Instead took a plane, I think, to Reno and put all of his money, which included, I think, his sister's trust fund money, on, I don't know, red or black or whatever, and made enough money to cover his payroll that week, and they made it. And I always think, what would have happened if he hadn't looked up at the board of departures and noticed a flight going to Reno? And if Dorr and Morris hadn't made that investment, would Larry Page and Sergey Brin be doing something different right now, or would they have eventually gotten to where they are? I don't know.
So the other thing was that company, nobody will admit it today, but that company was very acquirable in the beginning before they had a business model. There were any number of other big tech companies that could have bought Google for small amounts of money. And Larry and Sergey could have gone on to be mid-level engineers at Yahoo. And again, it's a twist of fate.
A fate worse than death.
That's what some people would say.
No, I mean compared to what nothing wrong with being a mid-level engineer at Yahoo, but compared to what they became, that's all.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so again, this comes back to limits of knowledge, which is like, how many great entrepreneurs are there who just haven't realized that they had a path that didn't involve going to a big company?
Yeah.
And then how many of the failures, how many of the business failures that we can all name were like one step away from success and they just didn't figure out that one step.
Yeah.
And those are the answers. Well, those are the questions we'll never know the answer to, but they're very tantalizing and they cause us at least to be, we have this kind of theory at our firm of sort of, it's a software term of what we call late binding. So we try to make what we call late binding decisions, which is to say basically delay making decisions on these things until as late as possible.
Sure.
Because you really never know. Like there's a very, very high risk that your early conclusions are going to be incorrect. And you really want to delay making a decision until you get every piece of data you possibly can, because it's just so hard to tell.
So in 2011, you wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal called Why Software is Eating the World. Explain your argument and why the evidence continues to accumulate that you were right.
Yeah, so the argument basically has to do with the evolution of the computer industry. So the computer industry is sort of one of these industries where it sort of had this trickle-down model for a long time where computers historically would get built for the biggest customers, which were big companies and big government agencies, and they would cost tons of money. And then 10 years later, 20 years later, somebody would package them up into a cheaper, form factor and then make them available to smaller companies. And then, kind of 40 years into the computer industry, the PC came along, which was the first thing that individuals could buy. And then 20 years after the PC, the smartphone came along. And the smartphone is a big breakthrough because the smartphone is the first computer that is packaged up and delivered in a form where everybody on the planet can have one. And so, the way I think about it is that the two giant twin kind of dominant stories of our era are, number one, the enormous rise of the developing world and the, introduction of billions of people into what we would consider to be the modern economy.
Yep.
And then in parallel with that, right, intertwined with that, is the smartphone revolution, which is everybody on the planet getting a, what is the equivalent of a supercomputer from 20 years ago in the form of a smartphone
that
in their pocket.
That they have with them all the time. So it's not everybody has them and have them all the time, has them all the time. Yeah.
And have them all the time, and they're all on the network, right? They're all connected. They're all on the internet. And so we've gone from a world in which most people didn't have computers, right? The PC only ever got to about 1 billion people out of 7 billion people total. The smartphone is going to get to all 7 billion. Two big things happening right now in real time. One is that in both India and Pakistan, the price of smartphones now has plummeted to $35. And so all of a sudden it's a $35 consumer purchase, which is within reach of a very large number of people. And then second is, even in the poorest parts of the world, to reveal consumer preferences, even the poorest people in the world will choose smartphone and internet access even over indoor plumbing and electricity, given the choice. And you hear people working in the field in the most poverty-stricken parts of the world who have not come back and report that. And so you really do have this you have this universal computer for the first time. Everybody's going to have one. These things are shipping in the billions now. By the end of the decade, everybody on the planet is going to have one of these things. So everybody's going to have a computer. Everybody's going to be on the internet. And that's a new world, right? That's a world that we've never lived in before. We have no idea what that world is like. It's brand new. Well, one of the things that is that all of a sudden, if you can conceive of a way to take a product or a service, and if you can conceive of a way to deliver it through software, you can now actually do that. So I'll give you an example. Let's just talk about banking as one example, which is, historically, the idea of having an online-only bank that was only delivered through software would have been considered lunacy because most people don't have computers, and so you need branches, you need tellers, you need ATM machines, right? You need this big physical footprint to build a bank. Today, you could just make the simplifying assumption. You could start a bank and you could just say, I'm only going to make the bank available online. And it's only going to be available to people through their smartphones. So it's just going to be software. And there won't be anything else to it other than just software. And all of a sudden, you could have a bank with an addressable market of 7 billion customers entirely in software without any of the physical overhead of how today's existing banks operate. And so this is the software eats the world thesis, which is we now for the first time can basically go field by field, category by category, industry by industry, product by product. And we can say, what would they be like if they were all software? And then entrepreneurs in virtually every field we're talking about are attempting to do that. And so there are entrepreneurs attempting to do software-only financial services, software-only education, software, healthcare, and obviously then, the media industry is being transformed with software. Obviously, e-commerce, retail is being transformed with software. And this is sort of where I disagree so much with people who are worried about, sort of innovation slowing down, which is I think the opposite is happening. I think innovation is accelerating because the minute you can take something that was not software and make it software, you can change it much faster in the future. It's much easier to change software than it is to change something with a big physical real-world footprint.
Yeah, if only we could stay in digital hotels, because the biggest cost of a hotel is they got to replace the furniture every once in a while. But that's for so many other things, the furniture is digital, so it's a piece of cake.
Yeah, exactly. And so what's happened is all of a sudden software professionals, and not just in the U.S., all over the world, software professionals, software entrepreneurs are looking at industries where historically they have not, industries that have not been tech-driven, industries that have not been internet-based. And then looking at those industries and they're saying, now's the time, right? Now's the time to build a software bank. Now's the time to build a software school. And there are entrepreneurs all over the planet who have figured this out, and they're going straight for it. And of course, our job as venture capitalists is to fund them. What are the consequences of this? Many things. Number one, consumer welfare is on the rise way more than I think people are willing to give it credit for. I think that, the universe of opportunity that opens up to you once you have a smartphone, in terms of your ability to get to all these services, your ability to get information, your ability to get access to global markets, your ability to get access to education. From a consumer welfare standpoint, this is nirvana, right? This is like everybody has the magic box through which they can get access to all this software. Like, that's amazing relative to all the physical limitations, the way things used to work. So consumer welfare is on the rise very fast and on a much broader footing than people believe. Even the poorest rural villager now has access to resources that the National Security Agency didn't have access to 10 years ago. So, that's an enormous sort of consumer welfare change. Rate of evolution, I think, increases in a lot of industries because software can mutate much faster. Prices can come down very fast in a lot of industries. One of the things that I think is very interesting economically right now is I think price deflation across the economy is a much bigger factor than people think because you take a product that used to be hardware and you make it software, or used to be a retail store and you make it software and you take out huge parts of cost, which means prices fall. And then I'd say probably the final thing is entrepreneurship is on the rise because everybody in the world who can write software, which is a large number of people, can now be an entrepreneur if they want to. And can go after these opportunities in many different fields.
So you've been very enthusiastic about Bitcoin, and we recently did an episode on Bitcoin. You've actually compared Bitcoin to innovations such as the personal computer and the internet. Very bold claim. What's the source for that enthusiasm?
Yeah, so this is not a claim that I have made about anything else in the last 20 years. So this is the first time I've said this. That indicates sort of the depth of seriousness with which I take it. Bitcoin Bitcoin and the ideas underneath Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is an instance of this broad topic, which is in the computer science world is called cryptocurrency. Which is sort of this area of R&D that's been going on for 20 years. One of the things about Bitcoin it's important to understand is it's not just an overnight thing that somebody just dreamed up. It's the result of 20 years of really hard work on the part of a lot of brilliant computer scientists that kind of finally catalyzed in the form of this Bitcoin thing. But there's very deep intellectual kind of background behind Bitcoin. The big breakthrough is in this idea called, this underneath Bitcoin, underneath cryptocurrencies, the idea is called distributed trust. And so the idea basically is, okay, take 7 billion people, put them all online with their smartphones. Okay, now you in theory have the ability to do business with anybody on the planet, but how do you know who to trust, right? And how do you do trusted transactions, right? How do you send, for example, how do you send money from point A to point B, right? Knowing who's sending it, knowing who's receiving it, knowing that the money isn't being, it's digital money that's not being copied along the way, which is what's called the double spending problem. And then how do you do a transaction with digital money in a way where everybody else around you is able to verify that that transaction actually happened, right? And so people can't say, oh, I was defrauded or I never got the money or, whatever. And how can you do that in a way that doesn't require centralized institutions? How can you do that in a way that doesn't require a bank, or a credit card company or a payment processor? And
or the Department of Justice or,
Well,
the police. The police. You need be great if you could avoid the police.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's exactly right. So contracts, let's talk about this for a second. So, right, contracts, the way contracts work in the U.S., right, is you sign a piece of paper. Well, okay, like what happens if somebody forges a signature? Well, you call the cops, you take it to court, you have a lawsuit, you go through like all this stuff, and you're exactly right. You either are working with the police or you're working with contract law and with courts. So you immediately fall back on these centralized institutions and, you hope they get to the right outcome. Well, what if you had a digital contract that was unforgeable? Right. So if once you signed it, like that was it. It was provable after the fact that you signed it and nobody else could have signed it.
And what you signed, you had to keep. That there was no uncertainty or virtually no uncertainty that you'd keep the promise that your signature represented, right? Because that's the other piece that's always uncertain.
Well, so the first thing is just being able to interact. There are consequences to many of these things, but the first thing is to be able to interact. So let me give you a basic concept of let's just take the basic concept of ownership. Right. So who owns what? Right. So who has title to what? Right. And again, in the West, we take it for granted. We've got, like real estate titles. We've got title agencies. We've got contract law around titles and all the rest of that. And ultimately, yes, there's enforcement. If somebody tries to squat in somebody else's house, there's enforcement. But we have very clear ways to determine who owns what. Of course, in a lot of the world, that's no longer.
They're very expensive, those titles.
Very expensive.
Right? When you buy a house, a frighteningly large amount of money has to go to prove that you're actually buying and selling the house that you both have in mind. It's a big set of institutions around it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, in much of the rest of the world, in much of the developing world, there isn't clear title, right? I know DeSoto's written about this a lot, and this continues to be a big problem in India. There's some, I don't know what the number is now, but there's some large percentage of Indian real estate and land in India, where it's just not clear who owns it. Right, and so this is sort of a generalized problem. And of course, if you can't own land, then you have the basis for capital and all the other things economists talk about. So then you kind of say, well, okay, we need to have a system through which everybody in the world can establish ownership. We can have a consensus view of who owns what, and it can have a way to transfer ownership from one person to another in a way that can be validated and can be trusted, without having to recreate these giant centralized institutions, which might either take decades to build, in systems where the governance is not strong enough to do that yet, or it might just be like prohibitively expensive. And it may not be possible to have what we would consider to be a modern title system for, land in the world where incomes are much lower, which, might be part of sort of the development trap, is it may just not be possible to have that. It may not be cost effective to have the institution required to let people develop economically. And so what if we could just do that digitally, right? What if we could just do that on the internet for free? Well, we can send email back and forth for free. I send messages back and forth. Why can't I send title back and forth? And there were a set of breakthroughs that had to happen around trust and around cryptography that had to happen, that in fact happened over the course of the last 5 or 10 years. And then the key breakthrough was this breakthrough, the Bitcoin breakthrough, by this sort of anonymous inventor, Satoshi Nakamoto, who came up with this idea of the blockchain, which is kind of this trust model for establishing who owns what, who controls what, who has committed to what at different points in time. And so that's a really big breakthrough. And so you can think about that breakthrough, Bitcoin, people think of it as digital money, and it is digital money, but it's deeper than that. It's potentially also digital contracts. It's potentially digital title, digital ownership, digital keys, digital assets, unique media files, which has always been a big problem on the internet. Single copies of media could be done this way. And then ultimately, digital stocks, digital bonds, digital loans, digital insurance contracts. And so you can kind of see where I'm headed with this, which is this kind of distributed trust breakthrough is a wedge that the technology has now made possible. And now what's going to happen, and this happening right now, is hundreds and soon thousands of entrepreneurs starting companies to do software-based contracts, software-based signatures, software-based keys, software-based title, on all these different categories, using this underlying Bitcoin technology. And that's what's going to happen in the next 5 years. And that's what we're funding.
What could derail that? What do you think threatens the viability, not of Bitcoin per se, but of this cryptocurrency distributed trust breakthrough? Is that breakthrough, is it over? We're done? It's solved? We don't have to worry about it anymore? Or are there things you think are still uncertain about it?
So at the highest level, it's hard to see it stopping. And the reason it's hard to see it stopping is it's just math. It's just math. It's just bits. And so it's like stopping the internet itself. Like for example, it's, you watch, I'll just give you an example. You watch this country's Turkey going through this right now, right? Where they're, they something happens politically and they decide they want, they don't want bad behavior, on Twitter or YouTube. And so they ban Twitter, right? And then the next thing you know is hackers in that country find 3,000 different ways for people to still be on Twitter. Or all the behavior then shifts to YouTube, and then they ban YouTube, right? And then increasingly they look like they're, doing terrible things to their citizens. And then at some point they reach a point where they just need to shut the entire internet off. But the problem is if you shut the internet off, you tend to drive everybody out into the streets. And that's the last thing you want if you're trying to prevent a revolution. And so, if you want to be, if you're North Korea and you can prevent people from using the internet, you can stop all this stuff. But I don't know how modern countries can shut off the internet. I think we're past that point. And so, short of shutting off the internet, you have to somehow, you'd have to take a very aggressive path to try to, intercept these bits. It's like trying to prevent people from talking. It's like, you could try, except there are an enormous number of people who want to make sure that the free flow of information doesn't stop. But
there's I understand you're talking about the government response, but what about the private hacking response? Is that, do you think the ability, just to take an example, to hack into somebody's Bitcoin wallet is that going to be a problem in the future, or is that quote solved? Is the problem of duplicate money, I forget the technical term you used, more than one copy, that I pay somebody and then they can somehow buy this two different rugs with the same coins? Are those technical problems? Do you think they're over, they're solved? Or do you think there are other risks involved technologically?
So those problems are solved in theory. So this is a complicated question, so I'll give a fairly complicated answer. So those problems are solved in theory. And the reason we know that those problems are solved in theory is because, like I said, this isn't just an overnight thing. This is something people have been working on for 20 years. And every step of the way, they've been trying to break it. At the same time, they've been trying to build it. Bitcoin itself has been now out for over 5 years, and many of the best hackers in the world have spent the last 5 years trying to break it. And there's been a huge financial incentive to break it. It has not been broken. And so, can I prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it never gets broken? No. Do I know that many of the best hackers in the world have been trying hard for years and have been unable to break it? Yes. In the real world, how do you know that something's secure? At some point, you know that something's secure because people have tried to break it and they failed.
Yeah.
Right? How do I know a vault is secure? Well, people haven't figured out how to open it. So theoretically, it's in a very good place. And by the way, we feel it's in a good enough place to obviously be able to back companies that are being built on it. And we watch, we're deep in this world. We're deep in the security world. We know a lot of hackers, so we track this stuff very carefully. And nobody's making any progress cracking it. So far, so good. And of course, and then every year that goes by, you get more and more assurance, because you have more and more evidence that it hasn't been broken. Now, that's in theory, and that's important, right? It's important that be the case in theory.
It counts,
right? Then there's in practice, right? Which is okay. Then it has to get implemented in the real world and get used by normal people. And so there you get into things like, your Bitcoin account is going to be protected by a password, right? And if you pick the wrong password and your password gets easily guessed by a hacker, then somebody can take all your Bitcoin. And that's still the case, but in a sense, of course that's the case, because that's the case with everything, right? If you do that with your email, people can read all your email. If you leave your car unlocked with the keys in the ignition in the middle of the street, come back in 2 hours, it probably won't still be there. And so it sort of reduces down to this, broader question of, making sure that the digital systems that we use are generally secure. And there's all kinds of work going into that throughout the industry, using, new kinds of authentication methods, using fingerprints, retinal scanners, all these different approaches to make systems more secure. And so, at some point you do have these kind of practical issues, but it's certainly every bit as secure as an online banking system, as an example. Like, it's about this way. It's more secure than a typical online bank. It's more secure than the Obamacare website. Like, it's more secure than most commercial websites. It's sort of beyond the point where you usually worry about this in terms of building a business. And then you just need to work with your users to make sure that they're doing responsible things.
If Bitcoin were widely used and accepted, and it's, I think, on the road to being that payment system, would you be comfortable with large chunks of your wealth in your Bitcoin wallet?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, so bear in mind also, right, Bitcoin, it's very clever about Bitcoin. The money doesn't actually have to be online. One of the interesting things with Bitcoin is you don't actually have to have the money in the wallet. Bitcoin is numbers. And so you can actually store your Bitcoin in a safe, you can print your Bitcoin out on paper and store it in a safe deposit box. Right? And so there's a variety, there's this called cold storage. There's a variety of cold storage methods. And there are actually companies now that are going into this business, the sort of Bitcoin cold storage, where it's almost like, it's like a safe deposit box business, right? Is it safe to store your family jewelry in a safe deposit box at the bank? Well, yeah, it's fine if all, they do
more
is protecting it.
More or less.
Yeah, more or less. And by the way, the other thing is, right, there's insurance, right?
Yeah.
You can insure your jewelry.
Yep.
Well, there will be a variety of different insurance mechanisms for Bitcoin, right? And so you'll be both Bitcoin wallet companies themselves are going to have insurance, and then you yourself will be able to buy insurance against these kinds of risks. And so it'll be like anything in the real world. It'll be a combination of, you don't carry all your money around in your back pocket with you in the form of cash every day. You store some of it in a bank account. You maybe store some of it in gold that's in a safe deposit box. Maybe you store, some of it, maybe if you're really paranoid, you bury it under your front porch.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of the same thing with Bitcoin. Like, you can do that. You can put it on paper and bury it in the proverbial mayonnaise jar under your front porch if you want to.
Well, let's shift gears. Let's talk about the news business. And
Sure.
You've written about that recently. Most journalists are very pessimistic, worried about journalism. They're the people who work for newspapers that I talk to. Other kind of journalists obviously are less worried, but you're optimistic about the future of journalism. Why?
Yeah, so I take a very different perspective on this. And it's a perspective based entirely on business and economics, and I'll kind of describe why. So if you kind of study the history, the news business is actually an old business, right? It's been around for about 500 years. Newspapers have been around for about 500 years. For the first, 450 years of the newspaper business, it was a brutally competitive business. Like, it was, one of my favorite books, there's a book called Infamous Scribblers, which is a history of the news business in colonial America. And it's sort of a good slice in time kind of thing of what it was like to be in the newspaper business, like in, colonial Philadelphia, like, 1770. And, which is like when Ben Franklin was in this business, right? And what you realize is it was a brutally competitive business where, any given, city would have 15 different newspapers, and, they would all have a different subjective point of view, and they would all be, some of them would be political attacks, kind of organs, and people were writing under pseudonyms. I think Franklin himself had like a dozen different pseudonyms that he would write under, to prosecute different agendas. And it was kind of this whirling free-for-all of kind of, activity and news and information and advocacy and politics. And it was kind of this zoo. And, it ran that way for 450 years. By the way, it created very large empires in the process. So the First Empire and the Pulitzer empires were, very big businesses based on kind of that kind of approach. What happened really, I think, was, especially in the U.S., after World War II, the news business consolidated into a set of oligopolies, into an oligopoly structure. And in particular, the newspaper business, it consolidated into local monopolies. And so what happened, and this was due to kind of scale economics, kind of per city. And so in any given major city in the U.S., basically over the course of a couple of decades, you went from 15 newspapers to 5 newspapers, ultimately down to 1 newspaper. And so you had the Chicago Tribune in Chicago, and you had the LA Times in LA, and kind of so on and so forth. And it was only the largest cities that would have a few different newspapers, but even there you'd have a big dominant one like the New York Times. So then 50 years passed where if you're a journalist, by definition, you were working for a monopoly. And, those of us who have worked with, companies over the years, there's a big difference in interacting with a monopoly or working for a monopoly versus interacting or working with a company that is in a competitive business.
Yep.
And, it's the difference between, dealing with a company that has to compete every day versus a company that
doesn't.
Doesn't have to compete, right?
Yep.
So like to say every monopoly has the same motto, right? Which is we don't care because we don't have to.
Yep.
And so you have these companies, and they had, they were companies, they're businesses like any other, and they had monopolies, and so they could act like monopolies. And so they had generations of managers, then 2 generations, 3 generations of managers passed. And at a certain point, you only had people going to work for these companies who wanted to go to work for a monopoly. And by the way, it worked. Like, these businesses got better and better. The newspaper business actually didn't really start to collapse until after 2005, right? These companies actually grew tremendously, even through the initial phases of the internet boom. They got very, very big margins, so the business executives certainly made a ton of money. Expense accounts, big fancy buildings, lots of long lunches, like the whole thing. So then, right, what happens, of course, the distribution technology changes. Right. The reason these all centralized in monopolies was because of the scale economics of distribution, right? Having the printing press and the fleet of trucks that would actually get the newspaper out, right? You had a scale advantage if you were the sole provider. The internet stripped the monopoly status on the distribution side out from under all these companies.
And then they took the revenue stream away from them too. So you had the ads and the classifieds and.
Well, they did something very specific there, which is it wasn't so much that you had new online newspapers that did the same thing that the offline newspaper did. It was that the product got unbundled.
Yep.
Right. And so, right, because in the old days, right, people had this sort of romantic view that a newspaper was like this bastion of democracy and kind of all this stuff that the journalists like to talk about. The reality is most of the newspaper was, the grocery store ads, right, and the car dealership ads, right, and
the want ads,
the want ads, right, the classified ads, the sports scores, the stock quotes. The funny pages, the horoscopes, Dear Abby, entertainment news, TV listings, right?
Crossword.
It was this bundle. It was this bundle of information, and it made sense for that information to all be in a bundle, and it made sense for all the revenue streams associated with all those components to be in a bundle because of the cost of distribution. Because it didn't make any sense to have 20 different specialist newspapers each covering those different topics. It made sense to have one where everything is bundled in. You put that on the internet, and all of a sudden, to your point, Craigslist takes all the classifieds, and Yahoo Movies takes all the movie listings, and Yahoo Finance takes all the stock quotes, and ESPN.com takes all the sports scores, and kind of on and on and on. And so the product got unbundled. The distribution monopoly fell away. The competitive battle started immediately, right? And the competitive battle has been really fascinating. You had newspapers competing with newspapers who didn't used to compete, right? The New York Times and the LA Times never used to compete, and today they do because as a user on the web, you can go to either one equally. And then, of course, the New York Times never would have viewed CNN as a competitor in the old days. But in the new world, New York Times and CNN, or NewYorkTimes.com and CNN.com are just 2 different websites, right? And so you have competition across media channels. And then you had this kind of great unbundling taking place, and you had the revenue vanishing. And so it felt like a perfect storm. Like if you're inside one of these media companies, if you're a newspaper publisher, it's like, oh my God, the entire thing is collapsing. And, there's a lot of truth to that. But the root cause, I just believe, has been misdiagnosed. The root cause is you were used to being a monopoly. You weren't used to competing. Right? And so what's the root answer to this entire thing going to be? It's going to be to compete. Right? It's going to be to take the stance of every business in the world that actually has to compete for a living and figure out fundamental questions. What's my differentiation? What's my competitive advantage? Right? What's the appropriate cost structure? Who are my customers? What do they want? Where am I unique? Where am I not unique? And so it's a time when we need proprietors for news organizations that are like the proprietors from the 30s and before. We need proprietors and owners and managers who are full-on capitalists, full-on aggressive business people who are very good at slicing up markets and identifying revenue opportunities, very good at rationalizing cost structures and all the things that you have to do in any normal business. And of course, this causes the journalists to just freak out because they're like, oh my God, the whole point of objective journalism is you're supposed to have this separation of church and state, and the business isn't supposed to affect the journalism, and now you're going to put up more business people who can be in charge instead of ruin the whole thing. And I take the exact opposite answer, which is the way to guarantee high-quality journalism is to have it be a successful business. And if you don't have a successful business, then at best you have a charity. You're in a worst case, you have a bankruptcy. And so you have to solve it you have to solve the problem as a business. The good news is that the market is much larger than it used to be, right? And this is something we think a lot about in tech, which is we think in venture capital, we think a lot about what's the market size of what you're going after. The internet has caused you all these problems, but the internet has given you a gift, which is a much larger addressable market, right? And so even the New York Times, historically, its total market size was the people it could distribute a physical newspaper or two in New York. Today, its addressable market is the entire world, right? And hundreds of millions of people around the world who need to know what's going on. And so these businesses need to be reconstituted around market segments that, have a need for a differentiated product. But many of those market segments are orders of magnitude larger than they used to be. Business and finance news will be the leader in the recovery because the rise of the number of people globally who need business and finance news, right, is growing very fast. And of course, those people have expense accounts, so they can easily afford to pay for information that's valuable to them. So I think the Wall Street Journal from here is going to do really well. I think that the Financial Times, probably at some point under a new owner, at some point is going to do really well. I think that, and then there's a variety of, by the way, new startups and business and finance news that are growing very fast that are going to do very well. And then general news and other categories of news will follow.
It's an inspiring story. I happen to agree with it. I think you're right. There's a lot of romance about being a journalist that I think isn't even true about the objectivity part and supporting democracy. We do need journalism journalism is useful for exposing tyranny and corruption, and I think it'll continue to do that. So I'm like you, an optimist. How about we're low on time, but I want to hear your thoughts on two areas that everybody cares about, which are healthcare and education. We've talked a lot about MOOCs on this program. Do you think they're real or overblown? Are they going to revolutionize education in the ways that we've been talking about? And is software going to change healthcare in the next 5 to 10 years the way I think it will? But I'm curious what you think. You're smarter than I am.
So we'll see. So I think the answer in education is a broader question. So I think the question in education, the real question is a broader question, which is the existing education system, especially at the college university level, actually works pretty well. And so, what I always tell people is, if you can go to Stanford, go to Stanford. Like I'm not on, my friend Peter Thiel's bandwagon of don't go to college. Go to Stanford, go to Harvard, and I went to University of Illinois, great school, go to Purdue, go to University of Washington. These are great. And by the way, there's lots of great, private high schools or public high schools that are very good. It's great. If you can get there, it's great. There are a very large number of people in the world and a very large number of kids coming up who are never going to go to any of those places. And we know that because the numbers just don't work, right? Yep. So just run the math on how many people are there in the world today, ages 5 and below, who are going to hit the, high school and college market, in terms of age, 5, 10, 15 years out. And the one thing we know for sure is they're not going to be on a physical Ivy League campus or a physical university, state school campus in the U.S. They're either not going to get educated, which would be a disaster for the entire planet, or they're going to have to get educated in a different way. And the only way to scale the education system to be able to meet the needs of everybody on the planet who needs to be educated, the only way to do that is through software, right? It's a ridiculously cost-prohibitive exercise to try to figure out how to replicate the campus model for the number of kids who are going to need to get educated. So the way I think about it is over a 20-year period, we have to solve this problem with software. A large part of the future of the planet depends on solving this problem through software. So, it becomes a moral issue actually quite quickly. So we have to figure out how to do that. And so the argument that's almost a complete waste of time is, would you rather have a MOOC or go, sit in the, lecture hall at Harvard? I think that's, that's not the question.
Yeah,
right?
I couldn't agree more. People say, well, face-to-face is so much better. I said, yeah, if you have a good teacher. How many people have a good teacher? It's much better to have a great teacher on the internet than an awful teacher face-to-face. It's no comparison.
Or no teacher face-to-face,
yeah,
right?
Because they don't show up in some parts of the world.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the big thing, and that's the big thing that has to be tackled. The other thing with it is I think there's really two kinds of students. The thing you'll hear about you'll hear from American educators, especially at top 10 institutions, is, you don't understand, you're naive. Like, kids don't want to get educated. Like, they only go to class reluctantly, and if you're not on their tails all the time, they won't even do their homework, and they're out partying all the time. And to me, that's like a symptom of people who are rich and lazy. There are a much larger number of people in the world who do not have that problem and whose parents do not have that problem, where the difference between educated and not educated is fundamental differences in quality of life.
Life and death, yeah.
Life and death. It's absolutely fundamental. And everybody knows it, and there's no illusions. And so this whole thing where, people like motivation for online education. Yeah, rich Westerners might like the motivation, but like everybody else in the world, who's going to have the motivation in spades and does today.
Yeah, they're kind of thirsty.
Yeah, and so we just have to figure out. We collectively have to figure out. And this is a challenge. Companies play a role here. Governments play a role. Nonprofits are playing a really big role. What like I'm a huge Khan Academy fan, as a lot of people are.
It's fabulous.
And what he wants to do over the long run is going to be just tremendous. By the way, teachers play a huge role. One of the huge opportunities, and you're obviously an example of this, but the best teachers in the world are going to be able to have a much bigger impact.
Yep.
As a result of this, right? Because you make more money. Reach a lot more people, exactly. And so this is one of those things where the best teacher, a lot of the best teachers are going to get really fired up by what this means for them and the impact they can have on the world. So, they're going to play a big role. So that plays out. Let's see. So while we're on really big topics. Healthcare. So the challenge in healthcare is also the opportunity in healthcare, which is to fix the incentives. The pessimistic view is that it's sort of an unfixable situation because the incentives are just badly aligned, and if you're not paying for your own health care, if you don't understand what you're buying, then you don't care what it costs, and that's when you get this sort of out of control kind of thing. And even if in theory you could break the cost disease and you could bring productivity improvements to technology, nobody has the right incentives to do it, and so it'll never happen. The two really positive things that are happening right now are in the U.S. that we're looking at very carefully are, number one, this dramatic rise in high deductible health insurance. And a lot of this is actually being sparked as a consequence of this. This may be one of the big positive benefits of the Affordable Care Act, is that a lot of people now are going to be operating under healthcare plans that have like $2,000 deductibles. And so all of a sudden, a pretty high percentage of the actual sort of health events that you deal with, you're going to be paying significant money out of pocket.
That'll change. That'll change behavior.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And so all of a sudden, and then it goes right back to the smartphone. If you give people the right kind of smartphone app, where instead of just going to whatever is the doctor and paying for it and getting whatever was thing you were going to do in the old days, let out of control costs. What if you could either get the answer right through your smartphone, or what if you could find it cheaper? For example, one of the big things in healthcare always is a lot of people go to see doctors for things that nurses can fix just as easily. But today's healthcare system, you have no reason not to go to the doctor. In the future, if it's an easily diagnosed and resolved problem that a nurse can help you with, you'll be able to just do that. And by the way, you'll be able to do things like, do reputation scoring on the providers. So you could find like a really good nurse or nurse practitioner to deal with, whatever your, minor problem is and pay a lot less money. So that's one big opportunity. The other giant underestimated thing that's happening is more big employers are self-insuring their employee bases. Right. And so, these really, really big multinationals, they're actually footing the bill for their employees' insurance more and more. And so there you have very professional management teams, finance departments, HR departments that all of a sudden have a huge incentive to drive down costs. And they can't drive down costs in a way that's going to damage their employees, because that would be counterproductive, and drive away the talent. But they have a big incentive to optimize a direct profit incentive, because all the savings drop straight to their corporate bottom line.
Yep.
And so we're seeing big companies as much more interesting adopters of new technology on behalf of their employees. And there's a big opportunity there. And so this, obviously this is a big one. This will take a long time, but you can envision a combination of changing, economic incentives combined with new technology, combined with, increased role of individuals and big employers, combined with technological advances. And it certainly gives you wedges to be able to come in and start to have an impact. And so I would say there's reasons for at least mild optimism. And then hopefully over the course of the next 10 or 20 years, we can start going after some of the really big problems.
Last question. Are you worried about anything remotely like the singularity, or the fear that technology is going to put everybody out of work except for the handful of people who can create the new software that's going to make our lives better? Or what's your feeling about that? Optimist or pessimist?
So very optimistic as follows, and this is the thing that we live in such a cynical and pessimistic time that nobody wants to think about the other side of this, so I'll put it out there, which is we are, with the smartphone, with the internet, with Google, with open source software, with all these things that we're talking about, we're putting unbelievable tools in the hands of everybody on the planet to be able to do things, in fundamentally better ways, to be able to get access to information, to be able to communicate, to be able to access global markets, to be able to get access to, up-to-date pricing, for their goods and services, to be able to, to be able to open up online storefronts, to be able to educate their kids, on and on and on. I mean, these are, it's like the Swiss Army knife of all time. You give somebody a smartphone, all of a sudden the entire world opens up. And so it's hard for me to believe that we're going to live in a world where, another 3 or 4 or 5 billion people are basically going to be able to participate in the market economy for the first time ever in sort of a fundamental integrated way. And that's not going to lead to just enormous economic growth, right? I mean, how could that possibly be the case? Right? We basically have to believe that all these people are going to have all these tools and all these opportunities, and they're going to do nothing with it, right? And so, which just seems to me to just be like paranoid and just dumb.
All the good jobs will be taken.
Exactly.
But there won't be any new ones somehow. Somehow there are no new ones.
Yeah. Job creation, right at the point of maximum opportunity, job creation will come to a complete halt. So I'm on the other side of it, which is I think we are on the verge of what could be a much faster rate of growth, globally, a much faster rate of growth than we're anticipating, just because so much more talent is going to get unleashed. I mean, there's so many smart people all over the world who have not been able to participate in the economy to their full potential, who are now going to have the opportunity increasingly to do so. So that means, potentially a flowering of human creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship. You've got this global spread of the entrepreneurship culture. You've got, just what's happening in China alone with entrepreneurship is just spectacular. You've got the global spread of venture capital. You've got the creation of all these new businesses, industries. You've got fundamental breakthroughs happening in science and research. So you've got all of these just incredibly powerful changes happening and really human potential being unleashed. I think the big questions are around institutions and leadership, which is, are the governments and the governance systems and the economic systems going to be, set up, reformed, structured in the right way so that people can actually take advantage of these tools, right? And so are you going to be able to raise money for your company? Are you going to be able to are you going to be able to keep money when you sell something in your company, or is it all going to be, taken out taxes? Are you going to be able to, hire employees, or, are you going to have, European-style labor laws apply everywhere where you can never fire anybody, so then you don't hire anybody, right? The sort of really big policy questions become even more important because they affect a lot more people. And, of course, there are many countries in the world that have extremely ambitious and hungry and talented populations where the governance systems are still, probably best described as kleptocracies, that need to be reformed. We need modern market-based economies. We need modern democracies. We need those ideas to spread as fast as possible. I think it will be a time of great political turmoil is probably my big prediction, which is I think, the number of government changes, government turnover, literally revolutions in the streets, seems like it's on its way up. People are becoming less willing to accept a bad state of existence because they're becoming more aware of the alternative. And so I think there will be a lot more political change, a lot more political pressure, a lot more political strife. And I think the stakes are going up.
My guest today has been Marc Andreessen. Marc, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Great. Thank you so much, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.